Hi, my name is Peter Evans. I'm a photographer and photography tutor based in southwest France. You know, despite all the amazing electronic wizardry we have at our disposal in the 21st century, the three fundamental principles of photography haven't changed one jot since the mid-1800s. No, really. I'm talking about getting a correct exposure, getting a properly focused image, and creating a pleasing composition. Now, I know from working with the many guests who've spent a week with me here in France that eventually everyone can get their heads around the technical aspects of those first two essentials. I'm talking, of course, about aperture, shutter speed, ISO and focus. But even if you nail those technical aspects, does that mean that your photos will be pleasing to look at? Well, unfortunately, the answer is no, they won't. No matter how clued up you are on all the finer intricacies of your camera's technical capabilities, unless you pay meticulous attention to the composition of your photograph, you stand little chance of creating an attractive, engaging image. What I like to call a wall hanger. Composition is fundamentally important to the art of all image making, whatever the medium, be it photography, painting, graphic design, video or movies. When I was learning photography, I gained a tremendous amount by studying the paintings of some of the great artists, and I've certainly been influenced in my composition by the work of Johannes Vermeer and J.M.W. Turner in particular. So how do you go about composing a photograph that is pleasing to look at? Well, there are two parts to the answer. The first you deal with when you take the photo, the second you deal with in post-processing. As W. Eugene Smith once said, a photograph does not end with the click of the shutter. Okay then, that's enough preamble. It's time to get some images on screen and make a start on showing you the 15 elements of composition that'll set you on your way to creating some great wall hangers. One of my favourite projects was shot in the beautiful city of Bordeaux. This particular image is from that series, and I've chosen it as my starting point because it contains pretty much every item of composition I want to discuss with you. And I'll be coming back to it several times as we progress through this session. So let's get started on our list of the 15 things you need to know about composition. The first and foremost thing to consider is the point of interest, sometimes referred to as the focal point. Almost every successful song that's ever been written has what songwriters call a hook. R-E-S-P-C-T, find out what it means to me. The hook is the thing around which the song is built. The hook is the thing that grabs and retains the listener's attention, and the songs with the best hooks are the songs that are the most memorable. Exactly the same principle applies to photographs. You have to have a hook on which to hang your reason for people to view your photo for more than a second or two, and that hook is your point of interest. Images without a point of interest don't work. After all, if there is no point of interest, what's the point of taking the photograph in the first place? So, before ever you put your camera to your eye, decide what is going to be your point of interest and create your image around it. A point of interest can be blatantly obvious, as it is in this image, or it can be more subtle, as it is in this next photo. Note the two cattle. Now, it's quite evident that the cattle are not the main subject of this image. It is essentially a landscape after all. However, as nice as the view to those cloud-covered hills is, without those two cattle, the image would be far less appealing. So, the two cattle are the point of interest, and they form the hook around which I built the image. Had those two cattle not been there, I wouldn't even have bothered taking the photo. See what I mean? It's possible for an image to have more than one point of interest. In this photo, there are two, the lampposts and the woman walking towards them, and the image needs them both. Take either one away and the image would completely lose its impact. There are 2 points of interest here also, the moon and the egrets. Again, the image needs both in order to work, as you can see. There are 2 points of interest here too, the walkers and the 2 trees, and again, both are needed. Take the walkers away and the picture loses much of its appeal. Take the trees away and okay, it's not quite so bad, but it's much better with both. With neither the trees nor the walkers, there is no point of interest and therefore there is no worthwhile image. When you have 2 points of interest, one will always be the primary and one the secondary. In the previous photo, the primary point of interest was the two walkers. The secondary was the trees. In this photo, the primary point of interest is my model, Lise Marie. The secondary point of interest is the tram, and because it's secondary, it doesn't matter that it's out of focus. In fact, it's deliberately out of focus because it's playing a supporting role in the story, and so it shouldn't overpower the main character. So where is the point of interest in this photograph, you might ask? Well, the point of interest doesn't always have to be so tangible and singularly identifiable as it's been in the previous images. Sometimes it can just be the light or even the shape and form or colour of the whole image. In this shot, the point of interest is quite simply the beautiful lighting and the aerial perspective. They are the two factors I've used as my hook to grab the viewer's attention. Okay, hopefully I've convinced you how vital it is for your photograph to have a point of interest. The next 4 compositional elements are just as essential, and the first of these is framing the shot. You know, I learned my craft shooting film, and when you shoot film, especially slides, framing the image as near perfectly as you can in the camera is an absolute must. And when I first moved from film to digital, it was exactly the same. Back in 2001, the resolution of my Nikon D1X was just under 6 megapixels, and every single pixel was precious, which meant that care with framing was essential. And now, even though I'm shooting with cameras offering several tens of megapixels, I still take exactly the same approach. Not to bother framing your image properly in the camera just because you have a very high resolution sensor is sloppy thinking. And sloppy thinking shouldn't have a place in the mindset of anyone who wants to take the art of photography seriously. I do crop in post-processing, of course I do, but my cropping is just fine-tuning. When framing, I try to get it right in the camera as far as is possible, and I strongly recommend that you do too. As serious photographers, we should always be striving for perfection. Always. We'll never achieve it, but we have to keep trying. That's what makes us improve. Just to finish up on the subject of framing, don't worry about the final width to height ratio of your image. As long as it looks good, nobody cares. This photo was shot with the sensor ratio of 3:2, but because I had way too much uninteresting space top and bottom, I cropped it out. It now has a ratio of 3.5:2, but so what? It doesn't matter. Okay, so that's framing dealt with. The second item in this group of 4 essentials is to decide what you want to see and what you don't want to see. The third is to avoid cluttered backgrounds. And the fourth is to resist the temptation to get everything in. I've given you all 4 of these composition must-dos at once like this because they're all related. And they're related because they're all determined by camera position and focal length. Actually, if you study this group for a moment, you'll see that all 4 of the items I've listed could quite easily be distilled into that second one. What do you want to see? And just as important, what do you not want to see? As I've said, what you include or don't include in your image is determined both by your choice of focal length and the position from which you're going to shoot. Just like your point of interest, what you include and what you don't include is absolutely vital to the success of your photograph. I can't stress strongly enough the care you should take before making this decision because it will determine the success or failure of your whole composition. And it's a decision you should make before you put the camera to your eye. You have to remember that the human brain can ignore things that the eye sees. The camera can't do that. It records every single thing you pointed at. So study the scene closely, focusing your attention on your point of interest. Then, in order to include what you want and exclude what you don't want, you first need to ask yourself, does the scene need to be shot wide or long or somewhere in between? Then choose your camera position. Move around, zoom with your feet, step from side to side, crouch, sit, kneel, lie down even. Then, when you think you have the right spot from which to shoot, that's the time to bring the camera to your eye and check that the image in the viewfinder matches the image in your head. Here's a photo of me doing exactly that. And yes, I know it looks like someone has taken my chair away. But the reason I was in such an odd position was that from a standing viewpoint, the cattle merged into the brown grass, and so my point of interest almost disappeared. I had to get the camera down low in order to push the cattle's heads up above that foreground horizon. When you have the camera to your eye, have a look around the viewfinder and double check. Ask yourself, is there anything I don't want to see here? Try to avoid including parts of buildings, trees, people, etc. that have nothing to do with the point of interest and that contribute nothing to the image. If you don't, you'll create a subconscious thought in the viewer's mind on the lines of, why is that there? Where does that go? What is that thing exactly? Who does that arm belong to? Things like this distract the viewer and greatly reduce the impact of your photograph, as is the case here. As I've suggested, you can usually achieve this by a slight change in camera position, or even by altering your focal length so that you no longer see the offending object. It's amazing what a difference taking such care with this can make. Movements of just a few centimetres, left, right, up or down, can make all the difference, as evidenced here. And what is not possible to get right when you're shooting, such as the back of that obtrusive traffic sign at the end of the street, you can deal with in post-processing. Because I feel so passionately about this what do you want to see and what don't you want to see business, I'm now going to give you a real-life example. This is a recreation of a photograph taken a few years ago by one of my workshop guests, who we'll call Dan. It's correctly exposed and it's sharp, so it's not a terrible photo by any means, but it isn't a wall hanger. It's what I call a record shot, one of those photos we all take when we're on holiday that says simply, this records where I was and what I saw. It's not a wall hanger because it doesn't have any impact. And it doesn't have any impact because it doesn't follow any of the what do you want to see and what do you not want to see guidelines I've just talked about. When I asked Dan what attracted him to this scene in the first place, he said something on the lines of, well, I really like the sunlight reflecting onto the underside of that main arch, and the stonework, and the shape of the arch, and the boats beyond. It's lovely. Plus, I really like the weir. And then he added, and I also quite like that arch on the left, and the woman in the red jacket fishing. And I thought it would be good to include the chateau in the background to give the image some context. And I think the trees add a bit of colour which contrasts against the roofs and the stonework. And of course, including all that in the shot meant that he had to have the right-hand arch in too. This is a classic example of a photographer trying to get everything in. So, there in the field, looking at the image on Dan's LCD, I began analysing it with him, and my comments went something like this. Areas 1 and 2 are the primary and secondary points of interest. Area 3, with the arch and the woman fishing, draws the viewer's eye away from those. If you like that particular scene, Dan, then that's fine. In fact, it's quite nice. But it needs to be a completely separate shot. It has nothing to do with the things that first caught your eye, your primary and secondary points of interest. So let's take it out. And I covered it up. Next, areas 4 and 5 add nothing to your 2 points of interest. In fact, they make the viewer's eye wander all over the place. All they're doing is cluttering up the image. So let's take those out. And I covered those up too. So now we were left with just the primary and secondary points of interest, the areas that had grabbed his attention in the first place. Then I pointed out that obtrusive sign, which he hadn't noticed. As a solution to all of the above, I suggested that we move to a point a few meters behind us where the riverbank projected further out. Shooting again from this new position and using a longer focal length, this was the final result. Compare the two. The revised image has much more impact. This is a record shot. This is not. It's a photograph, a potential wall hanger even. Okay, the 5 items I've talked about so far are essential things to consider if you want to achieve a well-composed photograph. The remaining 10 compositional elements on my list are not. Whilst each one is useful and desirable, and the more you have the better, none of them is vital, which means that you can use them in a sort of pick and mix fashion depending on your subject and your subject surroundings. The first of my pick and mix group of 10, and one that should be high on your list of priorities, is the rule of thirds. At art school, they will tell you that the rule of thirds states that an image should be imagined as divided into 9 equal parts using 2 equally spaced horizontal lines and 2 equally spaced vertical lines, and that important compositional elements should be placed along these lines or their intersections. However, important as this is, I urge you not to obsess over it. If you follow the rule of thirds rigidly, it will become your creative straitjacket. Your photography will become stilted and unimaginative. That 1/3 to 2/3 ratio is only a guide. The important thing is not to make a habit of placing your point of interest slap bang in the center of the frame. Of course, there are exceptions to the rule, notably when the whole point of the photo is symmetry, as it is here. Strictly speaking, symmetry itself is a compositional tool, be it complete like this, or partial like this, or this. But I like to include symmetry in the rule of thirds discussion because when I'm shooting a symmetrical photo, I like to use the thirds grid in my viewfinder as a symmetry check. Then in post-processing, I double check it using the thirds grid in Photoshop's crop tool. Okay, let's look at some more examples which illustrate the use of the rule of thirds. In this image, our point of interest, the stream, lies on the intersection of the left-hand and lower left thirds. Here, the primary point of interest is this ruined Cornish tin mine. You can see that the building lies on the right-hand third and that the secondary point of interest, the other two ruins, lie on the lower third, as does the horizon, give or take a few percent. Straying away from a strict rule of thirds now, the primary point of interest pictured here lies well below the lower thirds intersection, and so the sky occupies about 80% of the image. Therefore, nothing in this image sits on a third, but it doesn't matter in the least. Here, the primary point of interest, the ruined church, which is just about 100 meters from my studio here, lies within the lower third rather than on it. And over 70% of the image is occupied by the secondary point of interest, the night sky. Here again, we have an image where nothing is on a third, vertically or horizontally. However, the bridge towers occupy all the right-hand two-thirds of the image, whilst the left third is 80% sky. So whilst I'm not following the rule of thirds to the letter, you can see the value of the rule if you treat it as a guide, rather than something to be followed religiously. Note the deliberate inclusion of the cyclist approaching in the middle of the bridge. He's there to provide scale. You can use the rule of thirds as guidance even when you have a more general point of interest, as in this photo that we looked at earlier. Here, the clump of trees lower right is more or less on a thirds intersection, the foreground occupies the lower third of the image, the midground occupies the centre, and the distant mountains and the sky occupy the third. So the vertical thirds pretty much follow the aerial perspective. All of that was achieved by my choice of focal length and careful positioning of the camera. And finally, here's a photo that applies the rule of thirds exactly. The next topic in my pick and mix list of compositional elements is lead-ins and foreground objects. A lead-in is one or more lines or curves that lead a viewer's eye into the image, providing an illusion of depth. A foreground object is something in the immediate foreground that performs a similar function. Both help to give a two-dimensional image a more three-dimensional look, and there's no reason why you can't use both in the same image. Lead-ins and foreground objects are not always possible to find, but in the right circumstances they can help a composition considerably if they're there. In this image I've identified the lead-ins, and you can see that if Lise Marie wasn't sitting on that curb, the lead-ins would take the viewer's eye straight down to the end of the street. But because I placed her exactly on that point, your eye is now guided directly to her. In addition, having the corner of that curb very close to the camera helps with the illusion of depth. So I've used both lead-ins and a foreground object here. The lead-ins in this image are strong and obvious, as they are in that photo of Bordeaux's massive lift bridge that we saw just now. However, just like a point of interest, lead-ins don't have to be obvious. They can be a little less so, or even quite subtle, as shown here. In this photo of the walkers that we looked at earlier, we have two lead-ins based on the 2 points of interest, one taking the viewer's eye to the near horizon and the primary point of interest, and a subtle one based on the secondary point of interest, which leads the eye to the far horizon. Here we have an example of the use of a foreground object to illustrate depth in the photograph, something that can be used when lead-in diagonals or curves aren't available, or can even be used in addition to lead-in diagonals or curves. Lead-ins are nearly always made up of diagonals, and it's the subject of diagonals, triangles and curves that I'm going to discuss next. Diagonals, triangles and curves provide power and dynamism, and therefore appeal to an image, which is why this photograph works really well. This is a shot of what is arguably the finest Art Deco staircase in the world, and it consists of nothing but diagonals, triangles and curves. Shot from below, and therefore relying completely on the curves, it works well too. Diagonals, triangles and curves will help your composition a lot, and so you should try to include them whenever you can. In this image we have our curve, and in this image we have our diagonal. The diagonal in this photograph of a lotus is more subtle, but I moved my camera position deliberately in order to achieve it. Can you see it? In the last section on lead-ins, I talked about implied diagonals. By that I mean that the diagonals don't actually exist as tangible lines, but our brains perceive them nonetheless. In this lotus image, there's an implied diagonal here, which complements the other more visible one. Here are some more examples of implied diagonals. And in this image, there are diagonals all over the place, both actual and implied. And finally, when deciding on the composition of this image, I wanted the model's pose, sweater, hair arrangement and jewellery all to be based specifically around the concept of diagonals and triangles. Some of these are obvious, some are not so obvious, as you can see. Okay, moving on. Next on the list is keep your horizons level. A sloping horizon jars a certain nerve and puts your viewer off. In nature, the horizon never slopes, and most buildings outside of Pisa don't lean. You really do need to keep your camera level. If you find it difficult to judge whether the camera is level, switch on the grid lines in your viewfinder, or use any electronic level aids your camera may have. If you don't have any grid lines or electronic aids, then use the edges of your viewfinder as guides and stay parallel to those. Always check the level in post-processing and adjust if necessary. Okay, we're well over halfway through the list now, and it's time to discuss looking space and moving space. Let's deal first with looking space. This is a compositional convention which says that you should always give a living creature space to look into, i.e. within your frame, your image should have more space in the area into which the subject is facing than it has in the area behind it. I'm stressing the living creature aspect because for some reason I've met people who know about the rule but who think it applies only to humans. It doesn't. The next 3 images were all shot in the African bush and I've given each one looking space. What is not always made clear, however, is the fact that when the subject's body is facing left or right, but the subject is looking at you with head turned face on, just as you see here with this Abyssinian roller, it's still a good idea to have that extra space in the area towards which the body is facing. This cute little bird looks much better with that empty space in front of him than he does with the empty space cropped out. But it's not just humans and other living creatures that need looking space. You should give it to inanimate objects too, where appropriate. Now, before you throw up your hands and shout, "What?" just take a look at this. In this image, the head of the lily has a definite tilt to the left, and for that reason, I've given it looking space to the left. Now, you may think it's a bit weird to give something that can't see looking space, but just bear with me for a moment and I'll demonstrate why the same principles apply. Let's examine a crop of the same image. Here I've repositioned the lily further to the right in order to maintain some looking space, and it still looks perfectly fine. However, if I place the lily on the left, it looks completely wrong and is a much less attractive image. Let's now take a look at things that are moving or have the potential to move, such as a parked car or a moored boat, because similar rules apply. A point of interest that's moving or has the potential to move should be given space to move into. In other words, you need to have more space in front of your subject than you have behind it. The space you leave can be a little, or it can be a lot, or somewhere in between. If you don't give moving objects this space, the image will look odd and it usually looks like you almost missed the shot. But again, remember Wilde's quote. In this image, for example, the point of interest is the swan's method of getting airborne, and therefore depicting the splashes it's making behind as it takes off fills that space on the right with relevance, and that relevance overrides the need to have a proportionately greater amount of space ahead of it. So that's 5 of our 10 pick and mix elements covered. Next we come to the rule of threes, sometimes referred to as the rule of odds. The human brain finds groups of 3 more interesting than pairs or groups greater than 3. Why? I have no idea, but it does. Earlier on in this video, I showed you this image. Note that there are 3 ruined mines in the shot. Here's another photo of the same scene shot from a different camera position that shows only 2 buildings. It still follows the rule of thirds, it still has lead-ins and diagonals, but it doesn't have the impact of the image showing 3 buildings. Here's another we've already looked at, and another. Obviously this lift bridge has 4 towers, but I deliberately chose a camera position that showed only 3 of them. Even this image has a subliminal group of 3. And these red-throated bee-eaters look better as a group of 3 than if I had simply shown just the centre one on its own. Let's now consider the use of positive space and negative space. You will find several sometimes confusing opinions as to what constitutes positive space and what constitutes negative space in an image. I've always found it simpler to view positive space as the space in the image that contains items of importance, such as your subject, and the negative space as everything else. When you have a mix of positive and negative space in an image, you should try to get a pleasing balance of placement between the two. In this photo, the majority of the image, i.e. the blue sky, is negative space, the rest is positive space. The large amount of negative space here contributes greatly to the appeal of the image. Next on my list is colour, shape and form. Colour, shape and form are 3 compositional elements that can give an image appeal, and they're important factors in many of the photos I'm showing you in this video. In this one, for example, the appeal is not just the implied diagonals and the use of positive and negative space, which we've already examined. The main impact comes from the muted colours of the almost silhouetted shapes, the dominant blue of the sky, and the tiny halo of sunlight catching the woman's hair, achieved by shooting against the light, or contre-jour, to give the technique its proper name. The appeal of this basilica ceiling and the stunning Art Deco staircase again is based purely on colour, shape and form. Shot tight and framed and aligned precisely like this, images that incorporate patterns can become almost abstract. Earlier on I discussed the diagonal in this photo, but that diagonal is only there to give a subtle boost to the image, and the bees are just the cherry on the cake. Again, this image is based purely and simply on colour, shape and form. We have the beautiful shape of the lotus petals, revealed by shooting contre-jour, set against the form of the huge leaf behind. Add to that the fact that red and green are complementary colours, and there exists here all the ingredients of a very nice photograph. Complementary colours are pairs of colours that contrast with each other more than any other colour, and which, when placed side by side, make each other look brighter. So we come to our penultimate item, which relates specifically to colour. An area of strong colour, if related to the point of interest, helps to draw the viewer's eye to the place you want them to look, much like lead-in lines and curves. Red is particularly eye-catching. However, if that area of strong colour is not related to your point of interest, it can pull your viewer's eye away from where it needs to be and so risks becoming a distraction. And finally, we have what's known as the creation of a frame within the frame, which means that some feature in the shot, like an archway, doorway, window, gap in the trees, etc., is used to provide a frame for the point of interest, like this. It's not a compositional element I employ often because it's been done to death over the last 150 years and it's now somewhat of a cliché. Having said that, it can sometimes be used to provide context or scale, as in this photo of the total eclipse of the moon on 28th of September 2015, which I shot through a gap in our poplar trees here. The trees were lit by an LED torch, incidentally. In this instance, I used the technique to create within the main image 2 mini images of the Bordeaux Hôtel de Ville's sunlit courtyard, one framed by the main gate, the other framed both by the model's legs and an opening in the courtyard's perimeter wall. And the model was positioned specifically with these 2 mini images in mind. So there we go. That covers all the 15 things you need to consider when composing a photograph. Now let's just go back to the very first image I showed you and see how it fares when checked against those 15 items I've discussed. Well, it definitely has a point of interest, and it meets all 4 requirements from my what do you want to see and what do you not want to see group. It follows the rule of thirds guidelines. It has lead-in lines, and the corner of that curve in the foreground also helps to give depth to the image. The pose of the model provides additional diagonals and curves. Horizontals and verticals are level. The model has looking space relative to the direction her body is facing. There is a good relationship between the positive and negative space, and the image certainly uses colour, shape and form to good advantage. Plus, it has a strong area of colour related to the point of interest. And although it isn't strictly a frame within the frame, I have used the doorway at the end of the street to frame the model's head and give it real emphasis. So the only element that's missing from my list is the rule of threes, and that's simply because it's not applicable in this case. Lise Marie's brief for this shoot was to show me a girl who's been out clubbing all night with a boyfriend who's been behaving like an idiot and who's just stormed off up the street after a row. And now, at 5 o'clock in the morning, she's lost the will to care. She's tired, fed up and bitterly disappointed. And what's more, her feet ache. Of course, there'll be some who will interpret the image in a different way. I don't care as long as people like looking at it. And I know from comments that many people do like looking at it. However, I expect that few of those people will know that one of the reasons they like looking at it is the fact that the image contains all bar one of the 15 compositional elements I've talked about in this video. Obviously, this almost perfect situation is going to be rare, and I've achieved it in this case because I constructed the image from scratch, on site. Normally you won't be doing that, and so your images will often contain just a few of these 15 elements. The point is to try and use as many of them as you can.